So tonight, I wanted to talk about discourses of secrecy and silence in the post-tsunami Pacific. And really what I wanted to talk about is how, we're coming up on the one-year anniversary of Fukushima. And there's such an absence of conversation about a lot of the issues related to the radiation exposure there. And a lot of these issues are connected in history back to the Marshall Islands. And so there are these real connections between the United States, Japan, and the Marshall Islands that I wanted to talk about. And this talk is going to be dedicated to Sadako Mas and also to her family. And Sadako is a Marshallese member of this community who recently passed away. And so this talk is dedicated to her tonight, and Yakwe Komaulip to the Marshallese who are here tonight, and it's nice to have you here. Okay, so I wanted to talk about the US response to the current crisis in Japan. And so, as we know, the tsunami from a year ago, the waves disabled the nuclear power plants in Fukushima and led to large radiation releases in Japan. And so the response by the US government is very much linked to history and a US-Japanese relationship that has been very supportive of nuclear energy and nuclear power. And this relationship was born out of World War II. So we all know that during World War II, the US and the Japanese were bitter enemies. And on the left there is the propaganda posters similar to what we're seeing in this country during the war, where the Japanese were depicted as these evil, terrible, horrible people. Again, the bitter enemies of the United States. On the picture on the right there is a picture that was taken from Jaluit Atoll, and it's a picture of the Japanese forces who are in the Marshall Islands, and a picture of the surrender of the Japanese in 1945 when the US had came through and beat the Japanese military occupation, and then the US took control of the Marshall Islands from the Japanese. So even within the Marshall Islands, there's a history of both Japanese and United States presence there, and both are connected to military. And then at the end of World War II, again, we're just moving through some of the background history so we can talk about this. World War II, again, as we know, was ended pretty much with the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the United States celebrated the end of the war because our evil enemies were destroyed. And so in the United States, there was relief, there was celebration. But there was no discussion in the US public of the fact that the United States did not have to drop their weapons on Hiroshima and Japan. That was not required in order to end the war. That already a surrender had been negotiated and was going to take place. That really the United States dropped those weapons because it wanted to test what the effects of nuclear weapons were, their newest weapon, in a wartime situation. So that part of the history was omitted from public. And so this is the beginning of sort of what gets removed from our conversations and how our history gets characterized. And tonight I really want to look at some of those omissions and what's not talked about in the public discourse. And if you have questions along the way, stop me, because I'm fairly informal. So after the testing of the two weapons, and I think it should be characterized as testing in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because it was more than just a wartime use of the weapons. It was also a wanting to test what those weapons were capable of. Right after the testing in Japan, the United States then got a mandate from the United Nations to become the official administrating authority of the Marshall Islands. And the United States, when they acquired the Marshall Islands, they thought, okay, great, here's a country that is geographically isolated. It's very far from the public eyes. There's a small population here. This is the perfect place for us to test our nuclear weapons and learn more about what the effects of these nuclear weapons are. You know, Hiroshima and Nagasaki yielded some information about what the weapons could do in a wartime situation, but there was an interest to understand more about the capabilities of these weapons. And so the United States looked to its newly acquired territory, the Marshall Islands, to better understand the effects of nuclear weapons testing in the Marshall Islands. And so from 1946 to 1958, the US government detonated 67 atmospheric nuclear weapons tests in the Marshall Islands. That's the equivalent if the United States had detonated 1.6 Hiroshima bombs every single day for 12 years. And so the Marshallese know what it's like to endure nuclear war, maybe differently from the way Japan understands it, but the Marshallese have a full understanding of what nuclear war does to environments, what it does to people's health, what it does to the culture, what it does to the economy, how it affects virtually every aspect of life. And so the US testing was both to understand like the force of the weapons, which is shown in this mushroom cloud here on Bikini Atoll. You can see in the foreground there's some pictures of naval ships that were anchored in Bikini so that the US government could see how their naval fleets would endure an atomic detonation. But there are also tests that involved human beings as well, as the picture on the right there. You see a US doctor who's coming in and inspecting the burns of a young Marshallese boy after he was exposed to the radioactive fallouts. And when we think, again, the theme here of the talk tonight are the emissions and what doesn't get talked about and what gets removed from our discourse, and then what are the effects when that gets removed from our discourse. There's very little discussion of these human radiation experiments. It's something that's still not really talked about in the Marshall Islands. It's something the US government never talks about. It's a conversation that very rarely happens at all in public. And so following the detonation of one of the largest nuclear tests ever conducted in the world, in fact, the largest test ever conducted by the US, the Bravo test that was tested on March 1st, 1954. After a community, two communities, Rongelap and Utrecht, were exposed to radiation from the testing, the US government took the people who were exposed and brought them to Kwajalein Atoll and created a military encampment made out of barbed wire, where they put the Marshallese who had been exposed to the radiation inside the encampment and enrolled them without their permission into a top secret medical experimentation program called Project 4.1. And Project 4.1 was to test the effects of radiation on human beings. So up until this time, the United States had known what radiation had done to animals like lab rats or guinea pigs. They had known what it did in a desert because of the one detonation trinity that preceded Japan. They had an understanding of what nuclear weapons did in a wartime situation from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but they wanted to go the next step and understand what radiation did to human beings. And so the US government enrolled the people who were exposed to radiation from Bravo in this top secret medical program without explaining what the program is, without asking for consent from many of the people. Some of these tests included injecting radiation directly into the bloodstream of Marshallese so that the US could then study the difference if you expose somebody to radiation from fallout from a weapon or if the radiation goes into their bloodstream. Other human radiation experiments included having Marshallese drink radioactive substances directly, again, so they could compare what would happen if it went into the body via the mouth, and they could compare that to the radioactive fallouts. The US government took a control population that was not from Rongelap or Utrecht and had never been exposed to radiation from the testing program, and also had them injected with radiation or had them drink the radiation so they could compare them to the other group. And so they set up this medical experimentation. Other aspects of this experimentation included purposely resettling populations on highly contaminated lands so they could track how the Marshallese bodies were picking up radiation from the environment by eating foods that were contaminated, from living in a radioactive environment. And so the US government was coming every 6 months, or it varied at different times, but every 6 months mostly, to come and check the blood levels, to check the platelet levels, to track the amount of radiation. And the US was monitoring, yes, these bodies are collecting more and more radiation, to the point that the people from Bikini Atoll had ingested more cesium than any human population known on this planet to this day. And the US was tracking these increases and studying it, and knowing that the radiation was harmful, but that harm to the Marshallese was not as important as securing the military information that came from this. And so all of the information from the Marshall Islands was to help the US military, so that if there was a nuclear exchange between Russia and the United States, that was the concern at the time during the Cold War, then there'd be a better understanding of how the US civilians would fare. Or if the soldiers had to be exposed to radiation from a nuclear detonation, the US would have a better understanding of how the soldiers would fare. There was an understanding that the Marshallese were being harmed, but that harm was deemed accessible or okay by the US government because the military and security needs were greater at the time. So it's a part of the history that doesn't get talked about. Again, these omissions. And when we think about the impacts of radiation exposure, and we make decisions as a public, we don't have the full information to make our decisions about. Yes, so they tested both atomic and thermonuclear tests in the Marshall Islands.
And they measured that they
yes.
radiated the population.
Exactly. And what they would often do is put a tracer element in each one of the different bombs so that they could then track, so if they found radiation in somebody's body or in a plant or in the environment, then they could find exactly which device it came from. So they would put like arsenic in a bomb, and so that if you found radiation and arsenic in somebody, then you could trace it to the exact bomb. So each one of them had a different thumbprint. So to tie this back to Japan again, so the Bravo event was the largest test ever detonated by the US on March 1st, 1954, and that was a thermonuclear weapon. And it was detonated on Bikini Atoll. And I can talk about the Marshallese aspects of this story in a little bit, but to talk about the Japanese aspects of it, there was a Japanese fishing boat that had strayed within the waters near Bikini Atoll on March 1st, 1954. And the captain of the boat had known that the other ground zero location within the Marshall Islands, Eniwetok, had known that Eniwetok was off limits and out of bounds. But that captain didn't understand that Bikini had also been declared a test zone. And so the captain of this ship went within the off-limits area that's set up for each one of the testing and strayed into that area. And then when the Bravo test was detonated, the 23 crew members who were on that boat were all exposed to very, very high levels of radiation. So the radioactive fallout from the detonations had coated the ship with radiation. The US wasn't aware that the ship had been exposed to radiation at the time. And so the Japanese crew members who were on the ship realized that something terrible was going on. They had an inkling that it was radiation because their country had been through Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so the Lucky Dragon then, with the crew members exposed, started to get very sick right away, started, like the pictures of the Marshallese boy, to get the burns on their bodies. Their hair started falling out. They started to feel the effects of the exposure right away. And so the Lucky Dragon went from Bikini and went straight back to Tokyo. It had was full of tuna that was in the boat, because it was a tuna fishing boat. And the boat went back into port. And when the Lucky Dragon got back to Tokyo, and people realized that the crew members were suffering from radiation exposure, it sent shock waves through the nation almost immediately, again, because they knew what the radiation does. They could recognize it, they could see it. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese public was in, I mean, it was too much chaos for them to react about the fact that nuclear weapons had been used in their country. I mean, they were dealing with a wartime situation. They had been so obliterated by those weapons that, you know, that it was just like a sense of chaos. And so they couldn't really mobilize about nuclear issues at that time. But in 1954, after the exposure to the Bravo tests, by then the Japanese were aware of what radiation could do, had rebounded a little bit from World War II, so that when that boat sort of stumbled back into a port, having been exposed to radiation, again, like alarm bells went off in Japan. And so the Bravo incident in the Marshall Islands became the touchstone for launching off really a whole grassroots movement within Japan that became anti-nuclear. And so within the country, after the Bravo event, petitions were formed that tens of thousands of people signed. People took to the streets, they protested. The Japanese people demanded that the Japanese government ask the US government to stop testing nuclear weapons. The Japanese tuna industry fell apart. It went essentially bankrupt at the time because all the fish had been exposed to radiation. So there was economic collapse, and there was public outcry about these events. The book on the right is a new book that just came out about this issue, The Day the Sun Rose in the West, and it's written by one of the crew members of the Lucky Dragon, and I highly recommend it if you're interested in this story. So Godzilla. So why is Godzilla up there? So Godzilla, the story of Godzilla. Godzilla is born on Bikini Atoll. The story of Godzilla is that that monster comes out of one of the atomic detonations on Bikini Atoll. And the story of Godzilla was written right after the Lucky Dragon incidents. And Godzilla represents a mythological destruction that matches the nuclear weapons, because he's born out of the atomic bomb. So like atomic bombs, Godzilla can destroy cities and wreak havoc and kill people indiscriminately. And so Godzilla becomes the embodiment of Japanese fears about nuclear weapons. But his birthplace is Bikini Atoll. So then the Lucky Dragon incident happens in 1954. And again, the Japanese public is clamoring for the Japanese government to do something about this, to protest the use of the weapons, to compensate the tuna industry that had collapsed. And so the United States decided that it was going to offer Japan a political card to end the outcry about US testing in the Pacific, because the US was not finished testing nuclear weapons. The US still wanted to conduct nuclear weapons. So in 1955, the US offered enriched uranium to Japan for a nuclear power plant. And the US condition for offering this to Japan was that Japan not say anything about the US testing in the Pacific, and to not demand a stop of testing nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands. So because Japan is trying to rebuild from World War II and looking for an energy source to do that, Japan wants the civilian use of nuclear power. They want to have nuclear capabilities for their country. And so despite the Japanese citizens' outcry about this issue, Japan agreed to the US proposal. And in 1956, the first nuclear reactor was delivered from US to Japan. And the US kept testing in the Marshall Islands until 1958. And so Bikini and the Lucky Dragon incident became a political trading card, which allowed Japan to broker this deal and to receive nuclear reactors. So again, going back to this, to Bikini and the notion of Bikini. Again, Bikini is the testing site for the Bravo incidents that became the catalyst for these US-Japan new relationships that dealt with nuclear energy. Bikini is the birthplace to Godzilla, the ground zero for the Bravo test. But Bikini is also the atoll where Marshallese have been living for tens of thousands of years. And it's their homeland. And so the word bikini takes on such different connotations now within our public discourse. You know, when you think of bikini, the first association that everybody has is the bathing suit. And so if you think about almost like how perverse that is, that the name of the sacred lands of the people where these tests occurred, because in Marshallese culture, like the land is everything. That's where your identity comes from. I mean, there are plenty of people in this room who can tell you much better ways than I can, but that's your family's lineage, it's your social status. It says who you are, where you can live, where you can cultivate your resources, where you can be buried, where your ancestors are. There's no equivalent to that in the Western world. And so for the Marshallese, when land is everything and when land is sacred, so for the Bikinians, their land is their sacred home. And then to have the name of their sacred homelands on a very scant outfit that is worn by Western women, it allows the violence of the testing program to continue. It's a different kind of violence, but it's a cultural violence, right? Because if you think about bikinis in your mind, like if you think about bikini bathing suits, and I think I've got the image here. So if you think about a bikini bathing suit, think about who usually wears a bikini bathing suit. It's usually white women. It's usually women who have leisure time to go to a beach and lie on a tropical beach and no worry about time. If you think about the bodies that usually go in bikini bathing suits, they're usually very fit bodies, very healthy bodies, very beautiful bodies, very Western bodies, right? And so the people who occupy the bathing suits are the exact opposite of the Marshallese from the lands that have the name of the bikini bathing suit. You know, for many Bikinians and many people who are exposed to radiation, their bodies are gnarled, their bodies are deformed, their bodies are burned. Their bodies are the exact opposite of the bodies that get to occupy the swimsuit that represents the exact opposite of what their culture is. In the Marshall Islands, nobody wears bikini bathing suits. It is culturally offensive. People like the woman in this last image who's from Bikini, if you look at her outfit, that's much more like what a Bikinian woman, a woman from Bikini, would wear. Something that would be modest, something that would cover shoulders, something that would go beyond the knees, something that's radically different from the bikini bathing suit. And so the picture there on the right is a friend who recently went through chemotherapy in Hawaii, a Marshallese woman. But it's the idea of whose bodies get affected by this testing and just how different they are. I mean, the body on the left, again, in the swimsuit, It's a privileged, it's a white, it's a Western, it's a healthy body. And the body on the right that's mostly associated with the effects of bikini is a body with cancer. It's a body that cannot be treated in the Marshall Islands because there's no oncologist in the Marshall Islands still today. It cannot be treated in the Marshall Islands because there's no chemotherapy in the Marshall Islands. It's a sick body that has to come to the United States in order to be healed. And so the offense of that word bikini, it allows the cultural violence of the testing to really go on. Here's another image with bikini that I think it shows the appropriation of the word. Like, if we can take a word like bikini that can be a sacred homeland and twist it and perverse it so that it becomes a highly sexualized fashion garment that is associated. The reason the word bikini is on the bathing suit is because the French fashion designer who designed the garment was looking for something that was hot and flashy and new. And it was all the adjectives that were being used to describe atomic tests in the Marshall Islands that were then put on that new garment. And so when we look how our language has been, our language almost like, radiation is mutagenic. What it does is it mutates. So it mutates cells. It mutates the cells of plants, of animals, of people. Radiation is mutagenic, but the way we talk about this is also, our language gets mutated, so that the idea of bikini being a sacred homeland can now be the skimpiest fashion garment that a Marshallese woman would never wear. Like, it shows like the mutations of the language, and they reflect those mutations in the culture. And speaking of mutations, here's another almost perverse use of bikini. Again, this is a sacred homeland of people, yet it becomes something that we laugh about. So SpongeBob and his friends live on Bikini Bottom, and all of the characters in SpongeBob are wildly mutated, and their mutations are what makes us laugh. And so you think about Bikini Bottom and mutations. The mutations for the bikinians are not funny. It is not funny, yet it becomes our comic in the US. Like, this is something that we've become so detached from that it becomes funny. It becomes our source of humor. So this is what the Bikini Bottom actually looks like. This is one of those naval ships. I showed you that test earlier where the atomic detonation had, they were checking to see how the US naval ships would survive an atomic detonation. Well, plenty of them sunk. And so Bikini Bottom is actually littered with sunken naval ships that could not endure an atomic detonation. And so I guess it's just, we should stop and pause and think about our representations, because our cultural representations matter. And they also have impacts for the Marshallese. Another thing I wanted to look at in terms of language and how our discourse, again, is sort of mutating in disturbing ways. The US government likes to talk a lot about the use of clean bombs and clean strikes. Clean bombs being the idea that, they don't leave a mess behind, or clean strikes that just go in and knock out the military of a foreign country, but never touch the civilians. It's this idea that weapons can be clean. If you think about bombs or you think about any strikes, they're not clean. I mean, the notion of clean makes you think like sterile surgical hospital or something, a clean strike where, like if you're going in for surgery and you go in and you have anesthesia and somebody cuts your body and, blood's all over, and before you wake up, everything's sewn up and you're in white, pristine sheets again that are all starched and you don't see the mess of it. It's like everything happens and you're not aware and you wake up in a clean environment. And it's that same idea, but for a wartime situation. There is no such thing as a clean war. Like for the bombs that in Afghanistan, for instance, you know, there are going to be missing limbs, there are going to be blood splattered all over the place, but when we use a language around like clean bombs and clean strikes, it takes us away from the humanizing aspects of war that do damage to people. Another notion, again, like how we talk about this stuff matters, because it ultimately affects the kinds of policy decisions that we have and how these representations that we have. And so in the Marshall Islands is where the US still today tests what's been nicknamed Star Wars. So Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands is the largest atoll in the world, and the US still currently will shoot intercontinental ballistic missiles from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California and shoot them at the Marshall Islands. And the Marshall Islands is the bullseye. And then from the Marshall Islands, they send up the interceptor missiles. This is from Kwajalein Atoll. They send up the interceptor missiles and try to knock down the incoming warhead so that they can test the missile shield, the defense shield for the United States. And it's been nicknamed Star Wars. And so, as my two sons who are Star Wars enthusiasts know, one of the reasons my kids can watch Star Wars is because, think about it, in Star Wars, there's absolutely no blood. Like when somebody gets their arm lopped off with the laser, it's like, and the arm is gone. And there's no blood, like there's none of the grotesque blood. It's all just people just, and they die. And so it's kind of the epitome of like a clean strike. I mean, it's something that even kids can sit and watch and not be horrified. And so we've taken all the horror out of these stories. We've removed all of the horror and the pain from the stories so that the use of the nuclear weapons, the use of the missile systems are no longer something that's scary or problematic or troubling or destructive. And so these ideas too, like they carry over from our weaponry and our military applications over to our civilian uses too. You know, we've got this idea in our head of like nuclear energy as clean energy, and that starts with the nuclear weapons and clean bombs and then carries over to nuclear energy as well. This is from the website for the Nuclear Energy Institute, and that's the main lobbying group for the nuclear power industry. And so, you know, you see the image of clean nuclear energy, and then you see the family that's all holding hands and skipping through the grass. You know, maybe that's a faint outline of a reactor. I'm not really sure what the white swirl is. I'm not entirely sure what's going on there. But so you see this, like the happy family and nuclear energy kind of coming hand in hand. But again, when we think about the omissions, like nuclear energy might be happy, clean, and vibrant for some people. So for the wealthy and the privileged people who don't have to live or work near nuclear reactors, nuclear is not a clean energy for people in Chernobyl. It's not a clean energy for people who are downwind from Fukushima. It's a clean energy for some people who derive the benefits from it, but it's not a clean energy for the communities that have to store the nuclear waste that's left over from these or have to work in these facilities and be exposed to it. And so this imagery that we get into our heads only applies to some people, to a privileged population. Here's another image that comes from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's website page. And this is the federal agency that's supposed to be regulating the nuclear industry. So this agency regulates this agency. And so you look at the commonality in the message there. So protecting people and the environment, like who's ever going to complain about that? Like, of course that's a mission we're happy with. But again, like you look the happy people running around and not thinking about the impacts of the nuclear energy. And so there's this disconnect that occurs. So I think, again, when we have these associations about clean energy and this idea that nuclear weapons or nuclear energy can somehow be clean. Again, it's clean for some, but it's not clean for others. And this is a picture of a grandfather actually, holding his grandchild in the Marshall Islands. Again, we know that radiation is not clean. Radiation mutates, radiation kills. And exposure to radiation harms a lot of people, but it's not the people that are pictured in these advertisements. Nuclear energy also gets talked about as the great savior for our climate change concerns, because nuclear energy doesn't contribute greenhouse gases. Nuclear energy gets touted as, the answer for our national security too, because we don't have to depend on foreign sources of oil. But somehow we've never really been able to figure out, like, what do you do with that nuclear waste piece? There is no safe place to store the nuclear waste that comes from having the nuclear energy. So we haven't figured out that piece. And we don't quite know what to do with it. We haven't figured out how to clean up the nuclear waste at Hanford. We haven't figured out how to clean up the nuclear waste at Fukushima or Chernobyl. In the Marshall Islands, this is a picture of Runit Dome that's on Eniwetok Atoll. And Eniwetok was the first of the two ground zero testing locations other than Bikini. And so when the United States was done with the nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands, it cleaned up Eniwetok Atoll. This is an atoll that the US government now considers cleaned. If you look in the background there, you can see that there are no coconut trees. There's nothing growing on the really on the island. And that's because the United States bulldozed all of the topsoil, all of the trees, everything that was left after the detonations, after all of the testing, and bulldozed it into one of the craters that was left behind from one of the nuclear tests. So that cap there used to be a hole in the land where the land was vaporized from the detonation. And then all of the radioactive materials were bulldozed into that hole, mixed with cement and capped and left there. So inside of that nuclear waste storage facility is plutonium. Plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years, as many of you are activists around Hanford issues certainly know. It's the same thing. The plutonium that is in that facility came largely from Hanford. That was the plutonium that was processed at Hanford, ends up in the Marshall Islands in the tests. And so it's in this facility now, and it was constructed in the 1970s. In 1986, the US and the Marshall Islands agreed to end the political relationship and to let the Marshall Islands be an independent country. That meant that the Marshall Islands inherited this nuclear waste storage facility. It means that the Marshallese people and government don't have the money and don't have the knowledge on how to take care of and manage a nuclear waste storage facility. But now the US says that the Marshall Islands owns that facility. It's owned by the Marshall Islands. The US government won't import what's in this facility back into the United States because now the Marshall Islands is a foreign country and the US is no longer, it's illegal to accept imported nuclear waste. So it stays there. Going back to this notion of nuclear energy as kind of helping us to work through our climate change dilemmas because it doesn't contribute the greenhouse gases. One of the concerns about climate change, obviously, is that when the planet heats up, the warm air makes the seas expand and makes the ice, the polar ice melt, which makes the water level come up higher, which makes concerns about sea level rise. And in the Marshall Islands, that's a particular concern. Most of the country is about 6 or 7 feet above sea level. So it's really one of the frontline nations in terms of experiencing the effects of climate change. If you look at this nuclear waste storage facility, that's not what the US government calls it. They call it the Runit Dome. I call it the nuclear waste storage facility because that's what it is. If you look at this facility and look how close it is to the Pacific Ocean, all the way around it, the seas are rising, and there's no question. There are enough greenhouse gases that are already out there that the seas are going to continue to rise for the next 30 years, regardless. Even if we stopped all of our greenhouse gas emissions today, the seas will continue to rise. It seems pretty inevitable that that facility is headed for the Pacific Ocean. It seems pretty much inevitable at this point. If that happens, that's not just a problem for the Marshallese, because that plutonium goes into the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean borders Washington state. You know, this becomes our issue too, but I guess we have this tendency, and the way this stuff is presented by the US government is that these radiation issues happen far away. There's somebody else's issues. Like what's going on in Fukushima, that's for the Japanese to deal with. What's going on at the Marshallese, that's for them to deal with. These places are geographically removed, so we don't have to worry about it. But if that plutonium with a half-life of 24,000 years ends up in the Pacific, that's an issue for all of us. 1/1,000,000th of a gram of plutonium, if it's inhaled, causes lung cancer. So that's not just a problem or a concern for the Marshall Islands. Here's a quote. So after Fukushima happens, approximately a year ago, almost we're coming up on the anniversary, President Obama in the Rose Garden gave this speech in which he said, you know, we're going to be concerned about the citizens, American citizens, and we will stand with the people of Japan as they contain this crisis, recover, and rebuild. And so here's an opportunity. Here's essentially the most powerful man in the world and one of the largest radiological, after Chernobyl, like the second largest civilian nuclear disaster that's ever occurred, looking to him in a moment of leadership, and all he can come up with is, we will stand by the Japanese people as they deal with their problem. No mention of the fact that the US provided nuclear reactors to Japan. No mention of the fact that the US built most of the nuclear the civilian nuclear power plants in Japan, no ownership, no connection at all. So there's no critique of what's gone on, there's no concern expressed by Obama at all. And this, I think, is very much linked to the fact that, you know, about a few months, maybe 8 months later, the US then announces that after 34 years, there's going to be a shift in US policies about nuclear energy, and the US is going to start again building nuclear reactors for the first time since 1978. And the reactors this time are going to be Japanese exports of Japanese reactors to the United States. And Toshiba and Westinghouse have an alliance now to make those reactors and deliver them from Japan to the United States. And so the Japanese and US nuclear industries are so closely aligned that neither nation is going to criticize the nuclear policies of the other. And so certainly Obama could not be critical of what was happening in Fukushima because there's a US business interest in this. Since this time, I think Obama has cleared $8.6 billion in loan guarantees for that nuclear project to happen. So beginning to wrap up here, again, sort of my focus on this tonight is, if we're going to be making these nuclear policies and thinking about the use of nuclear weapons or civilian uses of nuclear energy, we need the full story. And our discourse and our language isn't yet talking about the full story. We lose all these stories about what the effects of nuclear weapons are, or the effects of nuclear energy. And here's one example. Most people know about the Japanese internment around World War II. So when Japanese Americans in this country were rounded up by the US government and put into internment camps because they weren't trusted during World War II. So that's a story that's been a part of the history that we've learned about. But nobody seems to know about the Marshallese internment that happened, about the same kind of encampments to the right that were erected by the US government to test radiation on human beings, on the Marshallese. And so we have one story of internment gets told and another one gets forgotten. And so we're missing the history, we're missing the stories. Here's a story of two Sadakos. Most of us know about the Sadako in Japan, the young girl who was exposed to radiation, got leukemia, and began to make the paper cranes as part of her wish to get better. That's been a story that's been told worldwide, but we don't hear about Sadako, who this is dedicated to, who grew up at Isaac Atoll here. This is Isaac Atoll. This is a map of the Marshall Islands, and Enewetak, where that nuclear waste facility is here. Bikini Atoll, where the Bravo detonation and other detonations took place, is here. Rongelap and Utrecht are the two communities that were put into that internment camp. And then Isaac Atoll is right here. So very, very close to Utrecht. When the Bravo test occurred, Isaac got coated with radiation, with the radioactive fallouts. And I did oral histories on Isaac and went house to house and talked to every single family on the atoll about their experiences following the Bravo event and the testing. And their stories align exactly with the people of Rongelap that I also did hundreds of interviews with about the effects of the nuclear testing. But the US drew this political boundary and said, only these areas up in the north, these two areas where the ground zero testing was, and these two communities that were put in the internment camp and became part of the medical experimentation, only that area is affected by radiation. And everywhere else in the country is not affected by radiation. So if you're in the Marshall Islands and you're from any of these communities down here, you're not eligible for health care, you're not eligible for any US government assistance to monitor the effects of radiation on human beings. And so their stories have essentially been removed from legal discussion, but also from our history about the effects of the testing program. So some stories get told and others don't. I like to talk about the emissions. When I do discourse analysis with my students, I always encourage them to look at what's absent, what's not talked about in the test. You know, when we talk about nuclear weapons or when we talk about nuclear energy, you know, this idea again that there can be clean bombs or clean strikes, like there's no such thing. Like the radiation kills, the radiation mutates, the radiation destroys cultures, it destroys lives. There's no such thing as a clean presence with radiation. And so when we look to the full meaning of what nuclear energy and nuclear weapons do, it involves death, it involves destruction, it involves multiple generations because, again, radiation is mutagenic and it mutates DNA. So it's not just the living people who are first exposed, it's all of their offspring. This child is 2 generations moved from the nuclear weapons testing in Utrecht. So this child's grandmother was exposed, but this child's mother was born after the testing. And so I guess, you know, the violence of the radiation exposure, it continues for generations. It doesn't just happen at a time in history and it's done. It's something that's carried in the DNA of people for generations. And so I always feel like when I talk about the Marshall Islands, that the topics are just so depressing. And they are. I mean, it really is. It's because it's such a crime. It's such an atrocity of what's happened to the Marshallese and to what the U.S. has done out there. And so I like to at least find something hopeful, you know, as we work to try to improve the healthcare, to clean up the environment, to raise awareness, to educate, to take positive steps. And so this is one of my favorite examples that I like to use. Chris Cunningham, who's sitting over there, is the lead singer for a local band called Ravenna Woods. And Chris was an anthropology student of mine at the University of Washington. And after he graduated, he went to the Marshall Islands and taught on Jalowit Atoll for a year. And when he was there, he worked a lot with Marshallese musicians and wrote a whole bunch of music and songs about the nuclear testing, about the Marshall Islands, and put together some educational material to try to educate people about the history of the US in the Marshall Islands. And what I love about his music and about him doing this is that it's that reminder that his generation and the next generation has this creativity and has these talents that I don't have, that are unique to his generation, that allow him to reach his generation and inform them about the history and get them involved in these issues in ways that I never can. And so I'll stop talking and I'll show you his video for a bit because it's fabulous.
On July 19th, the D-Day of Operation Crossroads, the atomic bomb supervised by Vice Admiral Blandy at Bikini Atoll in mid-Pacific.
Leaving your land that you'll never see again. Well, this ain't no fair trade. The price comes and wasn't everything you love. With your history, spirits gone. My love was one of the first to go. Now I'm fighting this one on my own. My boy was one of the first to go. Now I'm fighting this one. Hey! Out of sorts, out of line. what they said, just sing your own and don't look back again, just look ahead. Straight eyes and arrow, straight eyes and arrow. Don't hear their pleas, their screams, they might as well be ghosts. Remember, remember, don't hear their pleas, their screams, we might as well be ghosts. Remember, remember. Stay, I think I'll check out any day. Now leave your life, yeah, forget names. Remember all the rough times, trouble can't find you if you get moving out of town, out of state, out of here, leave this place.
Ending on a note of what can be done and what can be done positively. So that song, if you liked it, it's called Ghosts, and you can get it on YouTube. Pass it on to your friends. It's a powerful way to educate people about these issues. So I encourage you to pass it along and to support Ravenna Woods. Okay, questions? Okay, so this is, again, a map of the Marshall Islands. Bikini that we talked about extensively, the namesake for the bikini bathing suit and home of SpongeBob SquarePants is there. The other testing site was Eniwetok Atoll, and those are the two ground zero locations where all of the 67 nuclear weapons tests occurred. On March 1st, 1954, the communities of Rongelap and Utrecht, after receiving heavy doses of fallout from the Bravo test, those were the two communities that the U.S., 2 days after they stayed on the islands, the U.S. government came and evacuated those two communities and brought them down to Kwajalein Atoll here, where they put them into that military encampment and enrolled them in Project 4.1, the top secret medical program to study the effects of radiation on human beings. When the trust territory or the colonial relationship came to an end and the U.S. had to come clean about, there goes that word again, come clean. When the U.S. had to disclose what the full range of effects were of the U.S. nuclear weapons testing program, the U.S. said that 4 atolls were affected, the 2 test zones and the 2 areas where the test subjects came from, comprising 4 atolls. Those 4 atolls are legally codified as the only areas that have been affected by the testing program. If a Marshallese is from any other atoll anywhere else in the country, or if they're from one of these areas and were not here on March 1st, 1954, anybody else is considered unexposed to radiation by the US government. So the US has said that from this line and south is clean, that there are no detrimental effects of US nuclear weapons testing in the Marshall Islands. So being from Ilook Atoll, where Sadako was during the nuclear weapons test, that's considered a clean area by the US government. Even though we know from oral history, we know from experiences that the people all through the Marshall Islands, every single atoll in the Marshall Islands received radiation from the tests. And so this notion that there can be an unexposed area is ludicrous. So there are 1 million square miles that make up the Marshall Islands. So the ocean area is 1 million square miles. The land itself is about 70 square miles in the entire country. Utrecht and Ilook, I should probably ask the experts around here, about what, 50 miles, would you guess, apart? I have lots of Marshallese experts. About 50 miles, I would guess. Maybe less?
60 from Madro to Hour.
From Madro to Hour. Okay, that's 60. So maybe about 50, 60 miles. Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, when did the government declare that?
I'm sorry?
When did the government declare that with the areas?
It became legally in 1986.
I was just wondering, like, the hunger chemicals we're talking about.
Yeah.
Trace back into that.
Right.
What that's in
Yeah. No, it's just in 1986 because once 1986 happened, that was how compensation started to be delivered. And so before that, it wasn't done in any systemized way. Ashley.
What type of compensation is offered for people?
So the compensation, it's a complicated issue, as you can imagine. So the U.S. gave to the Marshall Islands $150 million total for all past, present, and future damages from the nuclear weapons testing program. And that's meant to compensate the people from these 4 atolls for land loss. It's meant to compensate people in the country for medical conditions. It's meant to cover every single cost. $150 million is the same amount that 3 Mile Island received in Pennsylvania, and just for a minute amount of radiation that was released that really had no long-lasting effects like in the Marshall Islands. And so 150 million won't clean up one island. 150 million doesn't pay for very much. The majority, so there are about 110 people who still receive medical care from the US government for nuclear-related exposures. Other people who have radiological conditions, as I was saying before, there's no oncologist in the Marshall Islands. There's no chemotherapy in the Marshall Islands. So even if you get cancer and you know that radiation causes cancer, and you know that there's a lot of radiation in the Marshall Islands because they conducted 67 nuclear weapons tests there. So even if you get cancer, you can't even purchase cancer care if you want it. It's not even available in the country. And so most people in the country, if they do have a radiological illness, they can get the equivalent of about $12 per patient per month for their radiological illnesses, which is not going to pay for Advil for somebody. So really the only choice is to leave the country. It's literally the only medical option for the people. And so the lack of a healthcare infrastructure in the Marshall Islands is one way that the violence of the testing program continues. Like, people are still dying from the testing program today because of US failures to build a healthcare system there. So the structural violence continues. Yes?
Did you, when you were talking and interviewing people at Marshallese, did you get into conversations about stillborns and young children dying and how people were taking it, and people told you stories?
Yes.
And
yeah.
You have that in the book?
I do, yeah.
Because that must have been some of the most powerful stuff that you came across.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I don't usually talk about it in public because I usually cry when I talk about it.
It's the grapefruit babies, among other things.
Yeah, exactly. And so it definitely was the most prevalent theme when I did the interviews, were the reproductive abnormalities experienced by the women, without a doubt. And as an anthropologist, what I did was look at the language of it and how historically in the Marshall Islands, they always had miscarriages and stillbirths like any population. And so there are Marshallese words for those, like jibung or ko. And those are words that have always existed in Marshallese because people have always had stillbirths and they've always had miscarriages. But after the nuclear weapons testing, women they gave birth to things that they had never seen before. And so they had to create a whole new language to describe it. And so when you talk to women in the Marshall Islands, they'll talk and say, you know, I gave birth to a coconut head. It looked like the coconut. It looked like a clam. It looked like a jellyfish baby is something in the Marshall Islands. It's a baby that's born with no bones in its body, and it has translucent skin, and you see the heart beating and the blood moving. Sometimes they live for a few minutes, sometimes a few hours, sometimes a few days. But the fact that these words like jellyfish are known everywhere in the country shows the prevalence of it. And the fact that the Marshallese often use non-human words from their environment to ascribe to a human shows the depths of the deformities of the children that they were given birth to. And, you know, some of the saddest part for me is that, you know, these communities that were exposed in Rongelap and Utrecht, they were told that they were exposed to radiation from the nuclear test, and they were told to expect gross deformities in their children. And so the US government was talking to them about it. On Iluk, in these places, they were told that there was no effect from the radiation. So when the women started to give birth to these babies, sometimes they were told that they were sinners, that they were offending God, that they must have cheated on their husbands, that they must have eaten the wrong foods, that the blame was placed on the people because it wasn't the radiation. And so many of the Marshallese women that I interviewed would give birth and then take their non-surviving offspring and go bury them by themselves.
I was going to ask about that. Was there a spot that people agreed that they would take the stillborns or the babies that were just born deformed? Would they take them to a certain spot or any of that? No,
there wasn't even the women didn't necessarily help each other. They were so embarrassed about it or not understanding. The women talked about how they thought it was their fault, that their bodies had done this. And so they had to grieve silently in a way that I think was even harder than some of the losses on the other atolls. And so it's that silencing and that lack of recognition meant that they couldn't grieve in a publicly acceptable way. It's a great question. You know, the Marshallese government is fantastic, and you were talking about in the introduction, I worked for their embassy in Washington, D.C. for 18 years, and have worked with all the presidents and all the foreign ministers and all the ambassadors in the country since they've been independent. They are all great leaders. They're all fantastic. They've all been active in Washington, D.C. They go to Congress. They ask for money for health care. They ask for money for cleanup over and over again. But the failures of the U.S. government have not been because the Marshallese aren't vocally advocating or asking for what they need here. The failures are just a political unwillingness to recognize the scope of damages in the Marshall Islands. You know, if the U.S. acknowledges all this damage that's happened in the Marshall Islands, they'll have to do the same with the downwinders in the United States. They'll have to do it with every group that's also been exposed to radiation. And so I think there's this unwillingness to want to establish precedents at all. It's also very difficult because the Marshall Islands has been reliant on U.S. government money. And so the U.S. dollars support the economy out there. And so if the U.S. Decides not to invest in the Marshall Islands anymore, that will affect other aspects of the economy too. And so it becomes very complicated. But the Marshallese they filed a petition with the U.S. government, and the U.S. government has said that there's no merit in the Marshall Islands claim. And so they've asked that all of these communities, they've asked that 14 communities be considered exposed by radiation so that they can get health care and get acknowledgement for what's gone on. And the U.S. has repeatedly denied those requests. And so, again, the Marshallese are great advocates for themselves, but it's difficult politically. Well, not necessarily for the rest of the country, but certainly for the Kwajalein landowners. And it's definitely another complicated political issue, no question about it. But the United States leases Kwajalein Atoll, and so they lease it to use it for the missile testing, and then provide the Marshall Islands with money in return. And so, you know, it's an ongoing debate whether the Marshalls would be better off with the U.S. leaving and that money, or whether or not the Marshalls is economically dependent and needs the U.S. to stay. It's an ongoing, complicated debate. Yeah. Yeah. But so true, and you raise a great point too, Nolan, because in the Marshalls there are communities that have been told before, it's safe, you can go back, and then they've prematurely relocated people, or they've purposely put people on contaminated islands so that they can see the effects of radiation on those populations. And so there's zero credibility in terms of declaring these places safe. And of course, it's U.S. officials that live in Washington, D.C. who declare these places safe, and then it's the Marshallese people who have to live there and assume all the burdens that go along with that. And then when there's no chemotherapy or no oncologist in the country, if you do get sick, then all the risks are with the Marshallese. Yeah, so it's impossible. I mean, radiation is an energy, and the only way that it dissipates is time. You can't make that energy go away. And in the case of plutonium, it's 24,000 years before it's half as strong as it is now, and another 24,000 years after that before it's reduced again. And so we're not prepared to deal with this length of intergenerational challenge that we're presenting here. And so this idea that these are clean or safe notions is just, it's ludicrous, because it mutates our DNA that we carry for generations. It stays in the land for 24,000 years. There's no cleaning up from this. Absolutely. And I think one of the hardest things about that too is now there's this new US proposal to not allow people from the freely associated states to come into the US anymore. There's this new proposal to cut off the ability of people from the freely associated states to come to the US. So if you stay in the Marshall Islands and you're exposed to radiation, you contract cancer and there's no health infrastructure to take care of you, but then we don't want people from the freely associated states coming into the United States because they're drains on our public health infrastructure, they're drains on our education system. It means that it's essentially a death sentence to be exposed to the radiation and not have the ability to get somewhere where you can heal yourself. And you know, the notion of the great babies too, that term in particular goes back to his question, great babies, and the fact that, you know, if you go to the south in Arno and Mille, the places furthest from the testing program, they know what great babies are because they've experienced them. So it shows how the radiation has affected those areas, that people know what great babies are. Great babies in English are hydatiform molar pregnancies. Their prevalence in the US is 1 in a million. And in the Marshall Islands, many times I get asked, oh, so do you know a lot of people in the US who have had great babies? Like, no, I've never met anybody who has had great babies. And a lot of women are really surprised by that. Great babies gets its name from after conception and the mitosis begins and the cells start to divide, at some point the cells start to mutate and become large, and they're like big purple sacs, like grapes. And so a woman feels like she's pregnant, and then at the end she gives birth to what looks like a bunch of grapes. And so Marshallese call it grape babies. And it's very, very, the fact that every woman in the Marshall Islands knows what grape babies are, and everybody knows and has experienced it, shows how prevalent it is. Yet it's 1 in a million in this country. Winta.
Sir, is there any way you can bring it up to the government of the United States that that place is contaminated with plutonium?
Yeah, you know, I think I guess the official US position, and I'm certainly not speaking for the US government, the official US position is that that is clean, that cleanup, that Eniwetok scraping, and that even if that plutonium facility falls into the Pacific Ocean, there'll be no health risk at all. And so that's the official US position. And so the US has no obligation, as they see it, to do anything about it. And so they're aware that the plutonium's there, but because it's considered safe, they're not worried about it. See, the problem is that there's no interest, like that the US doesn't want those records. They don't want those statistics. They don't want to know that information. And so the US has taken what information it has wanted from the Marshall Islands, you know, how radiation affects soldiers, how people uptake it, how it affects the thyroid. They're not interested in women's reproductive abnormalities. They don't want the statistics on that at all. There have been fires that have destroyed all of the medical records too. And most Marshallese have heard about these, but all of the medical records of the people exposed to radiation from the Majuro Hospital were all burned. All of the medical records of the Marshallese who were treated at Ibai Hospital, it was in the middle of the night, there was opened up one of the trailers, there was a fire inside of it. All of the medical records that were kept on Saipan when Oscar de Broom was the head of the Trust Territory government, his safe was opened up in the middle of the night, and all of the medical records and photos in there were burned. All of the backup records that were kept in Ohio, where a lot of the veterans' medical files, there was a fire in that facility too. So there have been, there have been 4 accidental fires of medical records, and there has not been one investigation. And so if these are all accidents, if the Bravo shot would accidentally expose people, if the fires accidentally occurred, then when there are accidents, there's usually some kind of investigation, but there's never been any investigation into any of this. I actually think the most effective thing that people can do, and it's something I encourage people to do, is to contact your elected officials. So rather than work through a nonprofit organization, you know, contacted Maria Cantwell is on the Senate Energy Committee that oversees the Marshall Islands. If you are a voter in Washington State, then you have sway with her. And so using your constituent voice and asking your elected officials to provide adequate health care to the Marshallese, to recognize the damages that have been there, to allow them to come to the United States to seek medical care if it's not available in the Marshall Islands. I think that's the most powerful thing that any of us can do. Yeah, okay. I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for coming out tonight.